that the faith of God has been progressing according to a plan. The plan began 6,000 years ago, then it got great impetus with the appearance of Baha'u'llah, and then in 1916, 17, 18, 19, Abdu'l-Baha revealed the Tablets of the Divine Plan, and Shoghi Effendi launched several plans which he said were part of the Tablets of the Divine Plan. And he said that every plan that we advance is part of Abdu'l-Baha's divine plan. So everything is growing according to some kind of divine plan. So thank you very much. And then we looked at some of the messages of the House of Justice beginning in 1996. And we found that the House of Justice said we are beginning a new process, what we call the advancement of entry by troops, which is a new stage, which we already knew was a stage Shoghi Effendi had identified the faith would enter into. Right now, we are in the stage of entry by troops, the advancement of the process. How long it will go, we know at least until 1921, because the Universal House of Justice said the goal of the first four-year plan in 1996 was the advancement of the process of entry by troops, and it would remain the goal of every plan until 1921. Now 1920, so it's 25 years of this period that we are advancing the process of entry by troops. During this 25-year period, historians will look back and say that the entire human race transformed during this period. We may not realize it now, because when you're in history, sometimes you don't realize what you're part of. Maybe the people, the peasants in the French Revolution didn't realize what they were doing, or in any great revolution they don't understand, because history has to look back. But even now you can see that the way in which religion is being organized and perpetuated is changing dramatically. Throughout history, for at least 6,000 years, religion was perpetuated by rabbis, priests, mullahs, gurus. You understand, there was some class of people who felt they had control or responsibility for the spiritual health of the masses of the followers. And now suddenly this has been removed from the religion. So God doesn't have to work through people. In other words, God doesn't have to work through the opinions and the mindsets of people who often want control or power or glory or money or fame. Do you see what I mean? So it's been hard for God to get the pure water to flow through the pipes of individuals. Because individuals, unfortunately, as we know, are prone to ego and prone to pride and so on. Isn't that right? So God says, now, 1996, we are going to change the way in which the Word of God flows to the hearts of people, and there's going to be no middleman. In business, we like to cut out the middleman, isn't that right? Yeah. Like when you want to buy something, if you can cut the middleman out, you can get a better deal, isn't that right? Or at least you think you can get a better deal. So, the middleman was always the guru or the mullah or the rabbi. And no matter how sincere they were, they only had their own understanding of the Word of God. The Word of God has the power to transform every individual directly, and the Word of God is unlimited in its power. In fact, we're told that every verse in the Word of God has a myriad meanings. Did you know this? So you can't say it means this. You can say one of its meanings is this, but you can never say it means this and only this, because the Word of God... In fact, in one passage, Baha'u'llah says it has a certain number of meanings, 42 or something. Another passage, he says that there's a myriad meanings in every verse. In one of the statements of the Bab, he says every verse has as many meanings as there are atoms in existence. And how many atoms are in existence? In fact, you can figure it out. One scientist actually wrote it down. It's a big number. But there's a lot of meanings in the Word of God. Now, if you go to a priest or a mullah or a rabbi, he says his understanding of it. And so then the Word of God gets frozen. So the House of Justice says, in 1995, when they're first launching it, that in order to advance the process of entry by troops, we need a certain thing to take place. I'm going to read it to you. This is their first message, which was just before the launch of the first plan in 1995 leading into 1996. They say we need the development of human resources to meet the needs of a rapidly expanding community. So they're saying that somehow there have to be resources of human nature. Not physical resources like buildings, not monetary resources like, money in the bank. We need the kind of resources that's human. They say large-scale growth necessitates sustained measures of consolidation. The urgent requirement is for formally conducted programs of training institutes and other centers of learning. This simple statement, first time we heard it, the House of This is saying we need formal programs of training institutes. This is what they said they knew. And so gradually then, starting in 1996, we received this system which we call the study circle. How many of you have been through some of the study circles? A few of you have. Now, the point is that this is just the beginning. There will be many more programs, and it will develop and it will evolve. In fact, the junior youth programs, how many books do you have in this country now?
8.
8? That's pretty good. Some countries only have 3 or 4. But you know how many they're already prepared now?
18.
I'm sorry?
18?
I think it's 18 or 19 or something, because I called the Ruhi Institute before traveling, and he said we actually have about 18 or 19 or 20. And they sent them to me. And the last 10, nobody has yet. They were just in draft form. They're developing it. So I realized that they're already thinking ahead. There are many more programs. This is just the beginning. It's like the little baby just came out of the womb. We don't realize how far it's going to go. But the key concept is that the House of Justice is asking every one of you to become part of a living system of growth. A living system of growth is quite different to any other form of growth. Scientifically, we understand this. You know that there are 2 basic methods of growth that we understand in science or in mathematics. One is what we call exponential growth, and the other is what we call arithmetic growth or geometric growth. Geometric growth or arithmetic growth is where every time you grow, the same unit increases. So we go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Or we can go from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 to 10, or 10 to 20 to 30. That's called geometric or arithmetic growth. And that's a certain way of growing. Is that right? So we increase by 10 every year or by 20 every year. Another form of growth is called exponential growth. Exponential growth is where there's a certain ratio from one to another. Then you apply that ratio now to the new one. And then you apply that ratio to the new one. So if we go from 1 to 2, we doubled. So from 2, we have to go to 4. And from 4, you have to go to 8. And then you have to go to 16. That's exponential growth, the exponential of times 2. There are many forms of exponential growth. One of the most well-known in science is what we call the Fibonacci sequence, which is the 1.6. 1.6, so it basically goes something like 1 to 2, then 2 goes to 3, and 3 goes to 5, and 5 goes to 8, and 8, do you understand that sequence? Okay, you understand? The 8 goes to 13, and so on. Those are all exponential systems. But exponential growth has a certain way of growing, and all living organisms grow according to exponential growth. They grow according to exponential growth. They do not grow arithmetically. They don't add the same unit. They multiply in a certain way. Now, it's interesting because way back in 1912 or whenever, Abdu'l-Baha said, each one should teach one. And everyone should teach one person once a year. And we all said, well, that's not so hard. If I just teach one person in a whole year, that would be okay. And then some Baha'is started to say, well, you know, if we had all done that, when Abdu'l-Baha said, the whole world would have been Baha'is in 1932. Have you ever heard people say this? Because they did the math. They said, how many Baha'is we had? Okay, if we doubled in 1923, it would happen. And it's true, it would have happened. That's exponential growth. But it never happened that way. And it never happened that way because we didn't have exponential growth. Because exponential growth requires that as soon as you bring someone into the faith, the very next year they are fully able then to bring someone else into the faith. And whoever they bring in, they can bring it in and so on. Because if you look at any living organism, every time a cell creates itself, it creates its ability to create another one. So when you have a human zygote, 2 cells come together, they create 4 cells. But those 4 cells have all the powers of the first 2. So they can immediately create and make 8 cells. And those 8 now have all the powers of the original 4, so they can duplicate. So the ability to self-replicate immediately is the key to living growth. And we call this geometric growth. Now, in science, they try to get people to understand the nature of geometric growth. And one of the most useful experiments they do is that they take a group of students and they say, imagine a bottle in which you put a microscopic microbe into it, a bacteria. So we put a bacteria in a bottle. And let's just imagine, just for argument's sake, that this bacteria doubles every minute. Okay? So imagine you put a bacteria in, and every minute it doubles. Whether that can happen or not, it doesn't matter. Just imagine it doubles every minute. And let's say that the bottle is exactly the size that if you put the first bacteria in at midnight, at the next midnight, 24 hours later, the bottle will be full. Okay? Whatever size the bottle is and whatever. So imagine you put a bacteria in a bottle at midnight, and the bottle's of a certain size that exactly the next midnight the bottle's full. Can you imagine that? Okay, so the first question we ask the students is, what time is it when the bottle is half full? What time is it when the bottle is 50% full? What time is it? Who can tell me the answer?
The minute before.
Okay, a lot of people say 12 noon because they think half. But in fact, the bottle is half full at 11:59 p.m. 1 minute before midnight. This is quite interesting, isn't it? Now, 2 minutes before midnight, how full is the bottle?
Quarter full.
It's a quarter full, only 25% full. 3 minutes before midnight, how full is the bottle? Right, yeah, or quarter, or you say about 17% full, right? 4 minutes before midnight, how full is the bottle?
Half less.
Okay, which is like about 8.5%. And 5 minutes before midnight, 11:55 p.m., the bottle is what, about 3.5% full? Is that right? Would you all agree? Okay, it's very interesting. It's been growing for a whole 24 hours. And 5 minutes before midnight, you look around and 97% of the bottle is empty. Isn't that right? It takes a very smart bacteria to look around, see 97% empty, and realize, because if they analyze the growth up till now, that in 5 minutes that we're out of a bottle. Okay? Isn't that interesting? And of course, this has great implications on ecology and environmental science and so on. So we're trying to grasp the concept of geometric growth, that it was a stable growth. If you mark it on a graph one way, it looks like this straight, and it goes up like that. But if you graph the exponential, it is a perfectly straight line. If you graph two different ways. But our minds don't grasp this. So let's say the smart little microbe or bacteria says, well, let's get ourselves some more bottles. Okay? So it says, let's get 2 more bottles. 2 complete bottles. Okay? How much time did they buy themselves by getting 2 more bottles at 5 minutes before midnight?
1.5.
They bought them 1 minute. Because 1 minute after midnight, they filled those 2 bottles. Isn't that right? If they got themselves 4 bottles, they bought themselves 2 minutes. Okay, you know, it's too late to get the bottles. That you have to think much before that. And this is a very interesting concept because exponential growth is remarkable because once you get right self-duplication, that inevitably happens. But you have to get the self-duplication. I remember when I went up to Papua New Guinea as a young Baha'i youth, I told you I used to go up there. Whenever you came back to Australia, they said if you get any strange illness, make sure you tell your doctor you were in New Guinea. Because there are weird illnesses and strange tropical diseases that they won't understand and they won't notice it, so make sure you tell your doctor. So I was in New Guinea one year, I came back and I went to university. Went to university for 2 weeks, I think. And then I was walking around and I felt this strange pain right inside my foot, in the ball of my toe, inside my foot. I was walking. It was a weird pain. So I looked at the foot, there was no cut and nothing. It was right on the inside. So I went to the doctor at the university and I said, there's a strange pain in my foot. The doctor felt it and said, it's nothing. Go home. It'll go away. Because he couldn't figure out what it was. I said, I want a second opinion. And he was very angry at me because I was a student and he was a doctor. So, but he went and got, it was a lady doctor. She came. She looked at it, they consulted, and they said, go home, it'll go away. And I said to the lady, I said, well, by the way, I was just in New Guinea. And she said, oh, did you have a good time? And I said, no, I'm not telling you, to have a chat here. I was told to tell you if I had something weird, I was in New Guinea. She said, there's nothing to do, go home. So I went home. And that night, I woke up in the middle of the night, in pain that you couldn't believe, and I looked at my foot, and it was bigger than a grapefruit inside it. Like that big, had grown to that size. I couldn't even get out of the bed, the throbbing pain like this, Someone had to come and pick me up and carry me to a car, took me to the hospital in the middle of the night. The doctor looked at it, I said I was in New Guinea, and he slammed the phone down, pushed a button, ordered, and they wheeled me as quick as they could into the operating room. Put my foot under anesthetic, put a big knife in between my two big toes, and go shoot, 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 and this green stuff that fills a bowl is put in the bowl. And they look at that. Okay, this is what happened. The doctor says to me after the operation, he says, "You're lucky you came in tonight. Tomorrow morning we would have had to cut off your foot." And I said, "Oh, what are you talking?" I said, "It's been 2.5 weeks." And I said, "I didn't feel a thing until this morning." He says, "You don't understand how these things work." He said, "You don't understand how these things." He explained it. And for the first time I realized I had reached that 5 minutes to midnight period, and suddenly it exploded. And this is how exponential growth does. It's just the way it does. So I learned a valuable lesson there. Fortunately, I saved my foot. But this is an interesting thing. Now, when Abdu'l-Baha said, "Each one teach one," basically what he was saying is that you must be a duplicator, but a complete duplicator. Now, the institute process that we've been given is not a method for you to replace your old deepening and the old ways in which you study. You know, a lot of Baha'is say, "I prefer the old way of deepening. I used to go to summer school with study classes." No, the institute process, the study circle, is a method that's created to cause what we call this geometric growth, because it's a system where everybody that comes into it can then, by assistance and accompaniment, cause others to come into it, and it creates replication. And so now, for the first time, we are told, we may be able to achieve geometric growth in the faith. Geometric growth in the faith may be possible to us if we can just master this system. But it does not work if you do not view the institute process primarily as a means for inviting and gathering humanity into itself. A lot of Baha'is have been inward looking in relation to the faith up until now. In other words, we look at the faith and we're very happy with what it does for us personally or our community. So we like our feasts, we like our deepenings, and so on. And the House of Justice says you must be outward looking. Can you imagine if the cells of the body said, "We're happy with 5 cells or 10 cells, okay? Then it's not going to grow because it's not alive. The cells have to always be looking to create new cells. And it must create new cells that also want to create new cells. So it must be ever outward looking. Now, every time I hear a Baha'i say, "I don't like the study circle," I ask them why. And it's always a selfish reason. It's always thinking about themselves or their Baha'i community that something else was better. But if they thought about that the study circle is a method of teaching and attracting people to the Word of God, it's a teaching growth mechanism. Keep doing all the other things you were doing. Keep studying the writings, having deepenings, having firesides. But now, let's see if we can become part of a living organism. That every one of you in this room are like a cell that can duplicate and be part of a living organism. You're not a dead, like something growing, that doesn't help the body. Okay, you know how you can have something growing on the body that's not helping it? We don't want that. We want everybody to join and be part of this duplication process. And so the study circle is something that attracts people directly to the Word of God. Because the Word of God is the only thing that has the power to transform human beings. Don't think that you have any power yourself, to change people. You don't have that power. The Word of God has the power. The Word of God is almost like magic. In fact, we're often said the Word of God is like water. Water is life. How long do you live without water? Who can tell me?
3 days.
3 days, they say maximum. And in Singapore, probably only 2 days, or 1 day. It's so hot. So you can. And when you first build a city, do you know what the first thing they build? If you look in archaeology, what's the first thing that was built to make cities? I'm sorry? You look at the Roman cities, or they have to build sources of fresh water. They have to build. If you look at the most ancient structures are aqueducts. Sometimes, way back, thousands of years before the Romans, they have aqueducts. They can find ancient ones that are 20, 30 miles. Because if you can't bring water into an area, you can't have large groups of people. And Baha'u'llah, in the Kitab-i-Iqan, he refers to the religion of God is the city. It's called the city of certitude. There's a whole passage. He says this city is renewed in each age. And you renew the city by bringing fresh water. You renew a physical city by bringing fresh water to inhabit. You renew the city of God, which is the religion of God, by bringing the Word of God pure into the hearts of every individual. The Institute process is building the spiritual aqueducts of the water of God into the hearts of every individual, and they get it pure. Nobody's filtering that water, no one's polluting that water. They can go and they can sit down and they can connect directly. So the way in which the Word of God flows right from God through the manifestation into the hearts of individuals is through a channel that we are creating called this Institute process. And if we view it like that, we won't be so selfish and thinking, well, I prefer something else for myself. No, because we're concerned about transforming the human race. And the human race needs to be transformed by the Word of God, not by us. Now, another important concept in the Institute process is that one must always be trying to assist others to become like them, to duplicate them. You must always try and duplicate yourself. Now, in the old days, someone had power or authority. Maybe they were a mullah or a priest or a rabbi. The last thing they wanted to do was make everybody else mullahs and priests and rabbis. Isn't that right? Because then they wouldn't have their power, they wouldn't have their authority, they wouldn't have their position, and so on. So the whole idea that nobody holds on to any position, that they replicate themselves fully, is a new concept. But it can be slower at first. I want to make this clear. Self-replication can be slower at first. Let's think of a simple analogy of what we call self-replication. There's an old saying that says, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for life. Anyone familiar with that? In Singapore, you have plenty of fish, so it's not so hard to do. So give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach him to fish, and you feed him for life. Is that true? That is a basic expression of the concept of self-replication. But if I can give a man a fish today, I may be able to give 2 or 3 other people a fish today. I may be able to, in 2 weeks, I may be able to give, say, 10 people a fish in 2 weeks, so I can give away 100, 150 fish in a day. I did pretty good. But if I have to teach a man to fish, it might take me 2 or 3 weeks. Would you agree? And so now only only 2 people have fish out of my efforts. Is that right? And whereas if I just kept giving out fish, maybe in the same period of time, 30 or 40 or 300 people could have fish. Would you agree? But how long does it take before this method surpasses this method? Okay, so in 2 weeks I can have 300. That means by the next 2 weeks, how many more can I have? Only 300. The next week, how many have? Only 300. Okay, so maybe in 6 weeks, 900 people have fish. Okay, what happens if I teach a man to fish? Okay, I teach him to fish so well, that he can then immediately teach someone to fish. So now there's 2 people that have fish. Then there's 4, then there's 8, then there's 16, and pretty soon, like the tortoise and the hare, the geometric growth passes the arithmetic growth. Even though at first you may say it is slower. It is slower. The key is get the self-replication right at the beginning. Don't worry that we have to convert hundreds. I just have to get a method down that I can attract somebody, they can be attracted to the Word of God in such a way that they themselves can turn around and do that. Just get that right with one thing. In other words, you tell a human zygote, don't worry about the human body. To look at the zygote, don't worry about the human, just figure out a way to go from 2 to 4. A way that goes from 2 to 4 that's living. And then that 4 will go to 8 to 16 and so on. And the House of Justice is saying, if you can get this right, then we are going to see this process of entered truth. So they're trying to create something alive. That's what the Institute process is. It's something that's living, it's something alive. Now, it may not be something that's done perfectly. It may not be something that's done perfectly, because we don't do anything perfect at first. But we need to realize that this is an entirely new method of growth in the faith. The House of Justice said that the Training Institute, what we could probably call in this part of the world study circles, is that right? In many parts of the world they refer to it as a Training Institute because it's a physical location in a building where they have it. But in most urban societies it's done in homes. Is that where it's done here? Or in Baha'i centers. They said it was the engine that is driving the process of entry by trips. It's called the engine that's driving it. Now, if you don't have an engine, like take the engine out of your car, how good is the rest of your car? It's no good. And if something's wrong with the engine, don't you take care of it? It's the first thing you need to do. But the engine is only a means to the end. An engine itself is useless. It has to drive something else. If you just took an engine of a train, just take the engine of a train and put it on the train tracks, does it do anything at all? Okay. The engine has to drive something else. So the House of Justice says, while the institute process will constitute the engine for growth in all clusters, a diversity of action is bound to appear at this level. The diversity will be a natural outcome of plans of action that take into account the particular resources of the believers, the capacity of the local Baha'i communities, and the strength of the local assemblies. So, basically, they're referring to a number of concepts. First of all, a cluster. What is a cluster? How many of you know what a cluster is? Do you know? What's a cluster? Yes, but in the Baha'i terms, what is a cluster? If you were Baha'i in 1994, and you read this statement and you saw the cluster, would you have known what that meant? Because the term cluster didn't exist in the faith. The House of Justice decided, as part of this plan, that they needed to find the right size unit for growth. And at that stage, we had national communities and we had local communities. And in some parts of the world, they had states. You know, provinces or states and so on, but that was it. And the House of Justice looked at it and said, in order to have living growth, we have to create little living organisms, and they have to be exactly the right size. Kind of like Goldilocks, you know, when everything had to be the right, not too big and not too small, just right. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. And now in science, they refer to planets as Goldilocks planets, because if they can have life, they can't be too cold, they can't be too hot, they have to be just right. The House of Justice says, we have to find a system that's just right. And they created a size, because the nation is too large and too centralized that they can't look after it. The local assembly is probably too small. You know, it's a little too small. So they said, first of all, we need to create living organisms. We're going to create clusters. Then they said that for a cluster to grow, it has to go through the natural way in which things grow in the world. And the way in which things grow in the world is through cycles. I don't know if you know this, that all living things go through cycles. They don't do one thing. They do a certain number of things in sequence and then back again and then back again. So, you know, you eat and then you digest and then you sleep and then you exercise and then you eat. You're going to say you do all these things. Now, you can't just keep eating. Some people have tried. And you can't just keep digesting. Eating and digestion are part of a cycle. Wouldn't you agree? Now, originally, the Baha'is had trouble understanding the relationship between teaching, what we call teaching or expansion, and consolidation, you know, or deepening or study and so on. And the two are part of the cycle. And constantly, the Universal House of Justice said, teaching and consolidation go hand in hand. You remember that? They used to write that in the 60s, that they go hand in hand. And Baha'i communities could never get it right. Some of them just taught, and they would have 20,000 new believers, as we did in the south of the United States, and then most of them we lost, because we didn't expand. Other ones said, no, we just have to completely deepen and consolidate what we have, and we didn't expand, and also that didn't work. Because, you know, we tried to do too much of one and too much of the other. You would not ever do this with eating. You eat first, okay, and then you have a digestion stage, an assimilation. You need to digest, you need to assimilate, you need to use, you know, whatever you take in, and then you actually have an elimination stage, which I don't want to talk about, but the point is that you do all of that, and then you eat some more. And there's a cycle. And there are many other cycles that the body goes through. The sleep cycle, you know, you go a certain time. Now, you can't do any of these too much. For example, I cannot eat all the food for a month in one day and then digest it all. I have to do it in the sequence of the cycles. So the House of Justice says we also need to understand that expansion, consolidation, and various other things go through cycles. And they picked a certain period, because all cycles have a period. For example, your body has a certain clock, which says that it must do certain things every 24 hours. It's called the It's called a circadian clock. It's in your body, and it regulates the release of hormones and various other biological processes. Without that, you would die. So you feel like certain things at certain times of the day. When you wake up in the morning, you feel like you want certain foods or coffee or something, and then certain times you feel. This is because you have a biological clock. There are many other clocks in the universe or in physical nature. Some run 12 months a year. For example, you know how the sun and the earth, they work on a 12-month clock, and there's others that work on a month clock, and so on. And there's seasons and so on. What do you think is the natural cycle of growth for a cluster? What period of time?
For what?
For a cluster.
Okay.
Because it's living too. Everything we're creating is living. What is the natural cycle for a cluster?
3 months?
It's 3 months. The House of Justice picked it, which is exactly the same as the seasons. And they say you must go through a process in which for a certain period of time you concentrate on expansion or growth or teaching, which is like eating. Then you must have another phase where you concentrate on consolidation or deepening or digestion, if you want to use the same analogy. Then there's a very another important process, which must mean you must reflect upon it. You must reflect upon it and see what you can do better or what you can do worse or how it particularly suits your ability. And then make a new plan for the next week and do that. And this is a living system. Now, a lot of us have, do you have reflection gatherings in this part of the world?
Yes.
A lot of Baha'is don't want to do the reflection part because they want to be told what to do. They say, oh, I just tell me what to do and I'll do it. You know, are you like that? Okay, so they go to a reflection gathering, and those that are in charge of the reflection gathering are just telling everybody what to do because they want to be the tellers, or other people want to be the receivers, and then they do it, and maybe nothing much happened in the previous 3 months, and they repeat that. That's a mistake, because if you repeat it, probably the same result's going to happen. You're just basically knocking your head against the wall. Reflection requires that you analyze your own environment, your own situation, you understand the principles, and you then consult. That's why Baha'u'llah put the consult in that very quotation. You consult on it and modify it according to your own needs. Here in Singapore, I believe, you have quite distinct needs. And they will be different to the rural areas of India or Cambodia or Africa or so on. There, you have an urban environment, but an urban environment with a very particular type of population coming from various national backgrounds and temperaments and so on. So you need to analyze this very carefully. Sometimes I say reflection gatherings are all gathering and no reflection. They're all gathering. In other words, call it a gathering. Okay. In other words, this is an essential component. And if one can get used to it, that we grow a certain way, and then we consolidate, and then we reflect, we say, well, maybe we should do this, that, this, and that, and then we start again. Somehow, you have a living organism. But it's going to require new institutions, new organizational structures, and new responsibilities for the auxiliary board and their assistants and new area teaching committees. And do you know all these new things that are coming? They are all evolving because as a human body evolves, it requires more and more complex organs. First you have the 2 cells, they become 4, 8, 16. Gradually it develops a spine. And then it develops a nervous system. And then it develops everything else. And now it has a brain and eyes and ears and nose and mouth and heart and liver and kidney. And all of these work in a principle that we call coherence. Coherence means that everything works in relation to everything else. And nothing is more important or less important. The unit is a single unit. So the heart is just as important as the kidney. It's just as important as the liver, just as important as the brain. Isn't that right? If you take any one of them out, they don't work. They each do their own job, but they're all dependent on the whole. And if one thing is weak, everybody tries to help that one thing. And so this is the system that we're trying to learn. Give it a chance, and you will realize that the House of Justice is creating something that is alive. It's creating something that is alive. Now, I want to look at a few processes of the 5-year plan that are quite interesting in my opinion. Things that are going on today. I don't know if I'll finish it today, but I just want to look at the few of them. First of all, it's the evolution of one particular institution that the House of Justice referred to first, well, in this process, in December 28 of 1999. How many of you remember December 28, 1999? You remember what happened in the year 2000? Like January 1 of what we call Y2K. Do you remember that? Is that what you called it here? Everybody thought the world was going to end. Some people thought all the computers were going to crash. Do you remember that? Did you think that here? And they were looking at their watch, only 3 days till the end of the world. So December 28, okay, it's just 3 days before the end of the world, okay? The Universal House of Justice, do you think they're worried about the crash of the computers? They're writing a letter to the Baha'is of the world, December 28, 1999. And the title of the letter is called Further Application of the Laws of the Kitabi Aqdas. Further application of the laws of all the times when the whole world is thinking we're going to crash, and they're further applying the Kitabi Aqdas. That really is the Y2K as far as I'm concerned. And they say that the Aqdas has many laws that Baha'u'llah gave that we're still not following, and some of them we should not or cannot follow because it's destined for future society. But gradually, certain laws become applicable and we apply them for the first time. And they said, we hereby announce, December 28, 1999, that one law in the Kitabi Aqdas that hasn't been followed before is now applicable, and that is the recitation of the greatest name, Allahu Akbar, 95 times every day. So, suddenly, as the